Hello, historians. Welcome back. At this point in the course, the war is on, and the Confederacy is doing pretty well in those first couple years of the war, like we talked about last week. This week we are getting to the turning point of the war, though. We're talking kind of the period of 1863, which is when the tables turned. And the Union, who was losing during those first couple years of the war, kind of turned things around and started to go back on the offense and put in motion military campaigns that eventually resulted in the Confederacy's surrender. One of the changes in course that the Union is going to pursue in 1863, of course, is emancipation, where they're going to change the aims of the war and the aims of the military war effort for the Union military away from maintaining the Union. I mean, they still want to maintain the Union, of course, that's what the fighting is all about. But they're also going to add a new intention to the war, which is the eradication of slavery. And there's a bunch of reasons for that you're reading about in this week's readings. So today I want to talk a little bit about the history of, a little bit of the history of slavery and the history of emancipation, the history of abolitionism, to, kind of bring us up to date on that. So, to start with, I'm not going to go back and cover all the long history of slavery. I'm not going to go back to 1609 and the first, or 16, whatever year it was that the first slave ship arrived in the New World. I'm not going to go back that far. I just want to start with the abolitionists. I'm going to talk a little bit about the movement of abolitionism, this effort to try to eradicate slavery. Then I'm going to talk a little about the pro-slavery argument that sprang up in response to the abolitionist movement. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the slaves themselves, and then we can get to emancipation. So that's my goal here. This video may end up taking a little bit longer than the last few videos. Sorry about that, but there's a whole lot to talk about here, and this may take me a little while. So anyway, get comfy if you haven't already. Okay, so first off, this image over here on the right, this is a slave overseer, of course, overseeing some slaves working out in the fields. This is from roughly the Revolutionary War era. Now, I'm starting with the assumption that everybody has started with at the time, that slavery in 1850, 1830, all the way back to, 1776, slavery was legal, and it was maybe not the predominant labor system across the U.S. It definitely was in the southern states, but it was, nationwide. It wasn't, it wasn't necessarily the most dominant form of labor, but it was legal, and it existed in a lot of places. So abolitionism is the aberration. It is the thing that developed that was new, because the basic assumption before the abolitionists came along was that slavery, okay, yeah, it might be icky, maybe. Some people might think it's icky, but the vast majority of people didn't think about it at all. It wasn't something that you worry about. It's kind of like, the general consensus was that slaves are like any other piece of property. They're like horses or shovels. They're just there. People abusing horses and shovels, that's not something that many people are going to worry about. So abolitionism, this movement of abolitionism where we want to eradicate slavery, that's new, and that's radical. And so in the 1820s, 1830s, 40s, 50s, even in the 1860s, abolitionists were the radicals. These were kind of the nut jobs that were out to destroy everything that the country had been built on. And it wasn't just Southerners who believed that, and I'm going to get to that in a few minutes here. But first off, I want to talk about the problems of abolitionism. Because abolitionism brings with it two very large questions. One is that how do we reconcile racism with equality, and how do we reconcile liberty with property? Because, I'll start with the second one first. As I just mentioned, slavery is legal. Slaves are legally the property of their owners. And so, that had been enshrined in American law for centuries. That went all the way back to some of the most famous laws were passed in the 1660s in Virginia about making slaves property and all that. But they were property all along. And that's the whole point of slavery, is that you own that person. And so for centuries, slaves had been legitimate property in the United States. And so, abolitionists, when they come with all their talk about, oh, let's eradicate slavery, well, one of the first questions that people would ask is, well, that's people's property. You can't just take away people's property. I mean, we talk about Enlightenment thinkers that always talked about liberty as being like the life, liberty, and property, as John Locke famously formulated it. Thomas Jefferson eventually changed that property part to pursuit of happiness, but property is still in there. You can't have the natural rights of citizenship if you strip away somebody's right to property. People are able to own whatever they want to own. And so if slaves are property, which they legally are under the Constitution, you can't just strip that away from them. That's a problem. So how do we maintain liberty while also stripping property away from people? That's one question that always got asked about to abolitionists. Abolitionists would get up and they would give their speech about how slavery is this evil thing, we need to get rid of it. And then, a question and answer session at the end of it, someone's going to raise their hand and say, okay, well, wait a minute, what about this property thing? The other popular question that's going to get asked right away is, well, wait a minute. It's true, though, that black people are inferior to whites. Because at the time, remember, this was the mainstream thought. We don't have this thought today, mainstream anyway, thankfully. But back then, in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, racism was the status quo for people, even among abolitionists. And this is why abolitionists never had a very good answer to, okay, we eradicate slavery? Well, what comes next? Are they going to become full American citizens once they are freed? A lot of people don't like that idea because, under the racist assumptions of the time, these people are inferior. We can't make them Americans. We can't let inferior people be trusted with the vote or anything like that. So there's this question of, well, what do we do with these people? Some abolitionists will say, well, yeah, they're going to become Americans with full rights, full citizenship, full voting privileges and all of that. Not very many abolitionists are going to say that. There's going to be a lot of other abolitionists that say, well, we will free them and then we'll send them back to Africa. But where they can go and be barbaric and uncivilized and all that somewhere else. We basically make them disappear. Kind of follow the old American Indian example, where Americans and British colonists before them basically just wanted the Native Americans to disappear. They didn't want to kill them all. They just wanted them to go away. Leave the property, let me take over the property, I'll run it much more efficiently, yada yada. Same thing with freed slaves. A lot of abolitionists, okay, slavery is the evil, not because black people are deserving of equality, but because slavery is evil. Slavery is the evil thing. We don't care one bit about black people. We just send them back to Africa. So abolitionists were split over these questions here. Are we going to compensate slave owners for that property that was stripped away from them? Are we not going to compensate them for it? If you can't own slaves, what's next? Can you not own an ox? There's lots of questions that abolitionists never really found a coherent, consistent answer to. And that's a problem for abolitionists. Because abolitionism is... We spend a lot of time in classes like this talking about abolitionists because they had an important... There's an important message in there about race and all of that. Abolitionists, though, were never as big a group as we kind of make them out to be. At their peak, there were maybe 300,000-ish people that identified as abolitionists in the United States out of a population of 30 million people. So we're talking whatever that math is, 1%, 1/10 of 1%. I'm not sure what the math is, but it's a very, very small number of people that actually identified as abolitionists. And because of a bunch of reasons I'm going to outline right now. Now, I just touched on this difficulty of reconciling racial equality with popular racism. Because Southerners were not the only ones that believed that black people were inferior. Northern white people believed the exact same thing about African Americans, about slaves and whatever. They're inferior, they're incapable of self-government, they're incapable of, functioning without benevolent white people guiding them through life. And this is apparent in things like this image right here, which was a cartoon in a magazine published in New York, an amalgamation waltz, where suddenly we've got a lot of black men dancing with white women. This is going to make a lot of people nervous because black people, under the prevailing racial stereotypes of the time, black people were animalistic. They were uncivilized. They were barbarians. They were heathens. The idea that we're going to let them dance with white women, it's terrifying. So white Northerners shared the same racist assumptions as white Southerners did. And so that's a problem for abolitionists, because every time they say, let's free the slaves, someone's going to come back and say, and do what with them? Let them vote? So that's a problem, and that's a failure of the abolitionists, because they were never able to come up with a coherent answer to that. Another thing that people would come back and is like, oh my God, if slaves were freed, what's going to stop them from taking vengeance on their masters? And so there was this fear that social disorder would happen if you removed the institution of slavery. Revolution might happen. And they could point to the Haitian Revolution, just, off the southern coast of the United States in the Caribbean. In the Haitian Revolution, which was kind of an offshoot of the French Revolution, Haiti, which was something like 90% slaves and 10% white owners and overseers of slaves, erupted in a revolution, and the slaves went on a rampage where they basically tried to kill every white person they came in contact with. And then they eventually declared their independence of France, and they tried to chart their own course and all of that, and Haiti has had a very rough history ever since. But from the American perspective, the terror of the Haitian Revolution was black people rising up and killing all their white owners. And so, whenever you've got people talking about abolitionism, it wasn't very difficult for a lot of Americans, North and South, to start wondering about, oh my, that's going to lead to all kinds of disorder, chaos, revolution. If we allow slaves to become free, they're going to rise up and kill all their masters, kill their masters' families, and then we're just going to spark this massive bloodbath. And so, no, we cannot accept or support abolitionism, because this might be the end result of it. So abolitionists are going to get a lot of pushback from that. They're going to get a lot of pushback from other Northerners also, because, again, these guys are the radicals. These guys are troublemakers. They are the ones they're the rabble-rousers. They're the ones that are, calling these meetings and saying these dangerous things like freeing the slaves and possibly making them American citizens. And so a lot of conservative, small c, conservative white Americans were very suspicious of abolitionists and were very resistant to allowing abolitionists to spread their message. And one famous example of this was in Alton, Illinois. Illinois was a free state, north of the Missouri Compromise line. So Illinois is a free state. Elijah Lovejoy was an abolitionist who moved into town in Alton, Illinois, and he set up a newspaper, an anti-slavery newspaper. And the locals thought, this is too dangerous. This guy's causing trouble. This guy is all these abolitionists like Lovejoy do are, they cause trouble. And one of the things they constantly complained about was that they're exacerbating sectional tensions. They are needlessly provoking the South. We don't need to fight against the South from the kind of prevailing mainstream perspective. Slavery is legal. It's the law of the land. And so all we're doing with abolitionist agitation is upsetting people, making Southerners angry, making Northerners angry. So all this stuff does is make tensions even worse. I mean, you can think, even today, people talk about this kind of thing. Why do people who supported President Obama always got angry at people that oppose Obama. Why are you causing trouble? People that support Donald Trump today make the same argument. Stop causing trouble. We should all join together, support our president. Even if we don't like his policies, we should support our president and go forward as a united front and all of that. People are making the same argument here. And so Elijah Lovejoy, he himself got his printing house burned to the ground, and he ended up getting killed by a mob of white Northerners who thought that he was causing dissension, causing turmoil, and he lost his life over it. He became, as this cartoon on the left is showing, he became a martyr to slavery, or anti-slavery, and the freedom of the press and all of that. So, neighbors turning on neighbors, because, the one neighbor is doing dangerous things. Even further east in New York, we've got this poster where outrage, an abolitionist of the most revolting character is among you, exciting the feelings of the North against the South. A seditious lecture is to be delivered this evening. We should all join together. Protect the Union. Protect the Union by stomping out this divisive rhetoric, this divisive language. So, sectionalism is a thing. People recognize it at the time, North versus South. And people like the ones that are publishing this ad here, or this poster, whatever you want to call it, were saying that the abolitionists are dangerous because they're only making sectionalism worse. They're exciting Northerners against Southerners and vice versa, and that's going to lead to trouble. And so abolitionists became the targets for, again, kind of mainstream thought that these guys are just troublemakers and they need to be ignored or run out of town or whatever. I talked a little bit before about the internal contradictions within the abolitionist movement. You've got people on the left, which are, this is a cartoon kind of related to the American Colonization Society, which was a group of guys who basically wanted to free slaves, but send them back to Africa. Don't let them be here where they're going to cause trouble, they're going to cause racial strife, whatever. Send them back to Africa, they can go and do their thing, whatever. So that's one branch of abolitionism, is free them, send them back home, theoretically. The whole sending them back home thing is kind of ridiculous because the vast majority of slaves had never actually been in Africa. And, maybe 2 or 3 generations ago, their ancestors had been in Africa. But the vast majority of slaves in 1830, 1840, 1850, the vast majority of them had never been outside the United States. So the idea of sending them back home to Africa is kind of it doesn't make any sense from a logical perspective. But from a racial perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Send them back home where they can be with their fellow inferior people, whatever you want to call it. So there's that branch of abolitionism. And then on the right side of the screen here, we've got William Lloyd Garrison, who of course is on the opposite side of the spectrum. He's one of the guys that's arguing for racial equality. These people are people, and they should be freed, and they should become full, productive members of the American nation. They should become citizens. They should be endowed with all the rights that all white people are endowed with in the United States. This guy was unpopular too. William Lloyd Garrison found himself the target of a lot of threats from Northerners and from Southerners. But this is showing that the abolitionist movement was divided amongst itself. Some wanted to send them to Africa. Some wanted to keep them here. There's some people there were other cockamamie schemes out there, but there were a lot of cracks within the abolitionist movement that prevented them from coming together and forming a unified front, which would be important in an issue like this. So the net result of all of this is that abolitionists were not persuasive to Southerners, obviously, because Southerners were in favor of slavery, and so abolitionists were the enemy. So obviously they're not persuasive to Southerners, but they also were not persuasive to Northerners. Northerners were worried about things like that social unrest. They were worried about the racial equality angle to it and all of that. So very few Northerners were very receptive to the abolitionist message, which is why, again, the abolitionist group became a fairly small group in the United States. Again, 1% or 0.1%. I probably should have done the math before I started recording this, but whatever. So it's a very small group of people. But they're a very loud group of people, and that's important. Because they were Southerners, Northerners. A lot of Northerners just ignored abolitionists. They're just they're the nut jobs, whatever. Some of them might turn on them like Lovejoy and all of that, but for the most part, abolitionists are kind of ignored in the North. Southerners, though, are terrified of them. They realize that abolitionists are, of course, by abolishing slavery, abolitionists are saying that Southerners are evil. Their way of life is evil, and they want to see the Southern way of life destroyed. They want to take away their labor force. They want to destroy their racial hierarchies. Abolitionists are very, very dangerous. And so Southerners are terrified of abolitionists. And so the Southern response to abolitionists is the important thing that we want to talk about here. Again, Northerners basically ignored abolitionists. they might pay attention here and there. Southerners became consumed with abolitionists, though, because abolitionists were dangerous. And so, Southerners responded in a whole variety of ways. So we've got, attention Southern men, down with the abolition press, meet at Schneider's at 8 o'clock tonight. I forget which city this is in, doesn't really matter. But it caused Southerners to start responding to abolition. Abolitionists started forcing Southerners to respond in kind of hysterical ways. Southerners started, policing the mails. That's what this image down here is showing. Abolitionist literature was pulled out of mail streams and thrown away. The mail service, when you mail something, by law, it's supposed to get to where you're mailing it to, unless it has dangerous chemicals or something in it. In this case, abolitionist literature, if it was mailed into the South, Southern postmasters would pull it out of the mail stream and throw it away. We're abridging First Amendment rights and all of that. That's okay because it was in service of opposing abolitionism. Over here, this was on the left, this notice to the public. This was actually from Bleeding, Kansas. The editor of the Herald of Freedom, which was an abolitionist newspaper, supposedly slandered this guy, Richard Ralph. And so they're going to, Ralph is declaring the other guy to be a coward and a slanderer, and with the charges of which I hold myself in readiness to prove. That probably meant a duel at the time, so that's cool. But Southerners are responding to abolitionists in a asymmetrical way, is one way you can put it. Abolitionists as a group, again, small group, not very dangerous. They were a small group. They did not hold power in Congress or the Supreme Court or the presidency. And so the abolitionists were a group that was small and couldn't really do anything. They were loudmouthed, though. Southerners' response to that, though, was kind of asymmetrical, as they would say in military terms, where you respond to out of proportion to the threat. Southerners went on full defensive mode. And I want to talk for a few minutes here about the defense that Southerners started to put together against abolitionism. But first, I want to point one thing out. Slavery was dying out around the world by 1860. This map we've got over on the left side, this is the New World, quote unquote, with the Americas, in 1820. Slavery was common throughout the Americas. You've got the American South, and then this is basically the Spanish and the Portuguese empires. Slavery, of course, was legal in those empires. So in 1820, most of the Western Hemisphere allowed slavery. Within a very short amount of time, 40 years, to 1860, we've got this map on the right now. By 1860, slavery was only left in the American South and in Brazil, and a couple islands in the Caribbean. This was because if you remember your world history, in the 1820s, all of these former Spanish holdings declared their independence and fought their own revolutions against the Spanish government and achieved their independence. And when they achieved their independence, every one of these former Spanish nations or former Spanish colonies declared slavery to be illegal for their own reasons, and you can go do some research on that if you like. I can talk to you about that if you're curious. But the fact remains, by 1860, there's only two places, large places, besides a couple islands in the Caribbean. The southern, what became the Confederate States, some of the Confederate States, and Brazil were the only places left in the Western Hemisphere that allowed slavery. So Southerners are defensive about that because, the trend of history seems to be going against Southerners. And you've got all those abolitionist loudmouths up in the North who just won't shut up about the slavery issue. This is going to lead, these two things are going to lead Southerners to start concocting new defenses of slavery, trying to justify the continuing existence of slavery in the American South. And as we're going to see, some of these things get a little bit ridiculous, but there's going to be an effort to create a coherent pro-slavery argument among those Southern slave owners that they can hopefully use, in their minds, to refute all of this abolitionist claptrap about the dignity of slaves and all that stuff that doesn't make any sense to Southerners, and also try to justify that no, we're going to stand against that trend of history where slavery is disappearing around the world. We're going to stand against that because of this argument, the pro-slavery argument. And in the 1840s, 1850s, as abolitionists get louder and louder, and things like, all those compromises in Congress start to alienate Northerners and all of that. So the Southerners are going to start concocting this argument. And this argument's going to come from many directions. One is that there's the historical argument. And I'm just picking these people are not the only ones that made these arguments. I'm just picking a couple of quotes that help to kind of get at what I'm going for here. So Edmund Ruffin, who wrote this book, The Political Economy of Slavery in 1853, made the historical argument. The slavery has existed from as early time as historical records furnish any and information of the social and political condition of mankind. There was no country in the most ancient time of its history of which the people had made any considerable advances in industry or refinement, in which slavery had not been previously and long established and in general use. Basically, the argument is look at all of the great civilizations of world history. The Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, all of these great civilizations that left behind these massive monuments. You've got the pyramids in Egypt, the Colosseum in Rome, the Parthenon in Greece. You've got these great civilizations that did amazing things with science, with culture, with art, with government. These great cultures that were the basis of our modern Western civilization, all of them were slave. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, every one of those great cultures, and all the other great cultures also that I'm not naming, but every great culture in the world has had slavery. And so, if you think about it, maybe it's not possible for a great civilization to not have slavery. That's kind of the inverse argument there. There's always been slavery. There always will be slavery. If the United States, from this perspective, wants to become one of the great civilizations in world history, it's got to have slavery, because every other great civilization has had slavery. So that's the historical argument. That is a religious argument, which is basically you look at the Bible and you see that there are lots of references to slavery in the Bible. And in this case, we've got this article from this journal, DeBose Review. We think we can show that the Bible teaches clearly and conclusively that the holding of slaves is right, and if so, no deduction from general principles can make it wrong if that book is true. Slavery is all over the Bible. You've got Jews being enslaved by everybody. You've got one of the most famous stories that people would say to use kind of a religious justification for slavery was the story of Ham and Canaan and Noah. You can look up that story in the Bible, but basically the gist of it is that Noah condemned one of his sons to eternal servitude to his other sons, and he supposedly put a mark on that son, and the religious interpretation of slavery is that mark was dark skin. And so one of the great races that descended from Noah, of course Noah is the one human that survived the flood, so therefore all humanity descended from Noah. One of the great races that descended from Noah, by biblical decree, will always be enslaved to the other branches of humanity. So slavery exists everywhere in the Bible. Everybody's enslaving everybody else. And so it's easy, you're looking for justification. Well, the Bible is a very popular and important text for a lot of people in the United States. Slavery is all over the place there. So we've got that argument. We've got the historical argument, the religious argument, the paternalistic argument, which is what I like to call the concern trolling argument, by George Fitzhugh, who wrote this book, Sociology for the South, or A Failure of a Free Society. The Negro race is inferior to the white race, and living in their midst, they would be far outstripped or outwitted in the chase of free competition. Gradual but certain extermination would be their fate. We presume the maddest abolitionist does not think the Negro's providence of habits and money-making capacity at all to compare to those of whites. This defect of character would alone justify enslaving him. If he is to remain here, in Africa or the West Indies, he would become idolatrous, savage, and cannibal. or be devoured by savages and cannibals. At the north, he would freeze or starve. There was a argument that Southerners liked to make that slaves, African descendants of Africans and their descendants were better off as slaves of white people, because white people introduced them to religion, Christianity, for example. Whites introduced them to, proper agricultural methods. Whites saved Africans from themselves. That's kind of a popular argument that a lot of these people made. And so, and that's the argument that Fitzhugh is making here, that blacks wouldn't be able to survive, they wouldn't be able to function. What he's saying here is that if we freed them and left them here in the United States, they would have to compete against white people for jobs, for resources, for housing, for whatever. And the problem is that white people are so obviously superior, in this guy's mind, to black people, that black people would not be able to survive. They would just simply die. And so what Southerners are doing is helping slaves, helping black people, by not allowing them to die from competition with white people. And so there was kind of a popular argument that we are, what historians often call paternalism. We are taking care of these people. As the white slave owner, I'm like the father of the family. And all of these slaves, these are my children. And I'm taking care of them. And I want to take care of them because I want them to succeed. There's even a capitalist take on all of this, believe it or not, where Southerners would say that, in the North, if there's an economic recession or a depression, who suffers first? It's the poor people. They're the ones that always suffer. Rich people don't really suffer in recessions or Great Depressions all that much because they've got money to fall back on. It's always the poor people that suffer in the North during economic crises. However, in the South, under a slave system, of course, the poorest people are black slaves. And black slaves don't suffer at all during economic recessions or depressions. Because they're being taken care of by other people. And so the masters are the ones that suffer more than black people do in recessions and depressions and all of that. So again, this is a good thing for blacks and for slaves, because they're being protected from the whims of capitalism. They're being protected from the winds of competition. They're being protected just in general through this institution of slavery, and so this is for the best for them. And then there were scientific arguments. These are the ones that get particularly nutty. Samuel A. Cartwright was a doctor who wrote this book, The Report on the Diseases and Physical Peculiarities of the Negro Race, where he tried to talk about how are black people different from white people physically, anatomically, scientifically. How are these people different? And so just the quote to kind of get us started here is that it is commonly taken for granted that the color of the skin constitutes the main and essential difference between the black and the white race. But there are other differences, more deep, durable, and indelible, in their anatomy and physiology than that of mere color. It is not only in the skin that a difference of color exists between the Negro and the white man, but in the membranes, the muscles, the tendons, and in the fluids and the secretions. Even the Negro's brain and nerves, the chyle and the humors, are tinctured with a shade of the pervading darkness. His bile is of a deeper color, and his blood is blacker than the white man's. So they go and they start measuring skulls, and they start measuring bones, and they start basically measuring different people, and they look for trends, and they basically identify some trends saying that black people are just physically different. And in this enlightened era where we categorize everything, you can't put black people and white people in the same category if they are physically different. Because physical differences, from a scientific perspective, lead to other differences also. You've got different shapes of the cranium, meaning different shaped brains, different size brains, brains that do different things. And so people like Cartwright wrote an entire literature explaining all the various anatomical scientific differences as a way to justify discrimination between the races. Cartwright himself came up with a bunch of actual diseases that he believed plagued black people that did not plague white people. These diseases are so weird. Negro consumption is a condition that he noticed among a lot of slaves, where they are nervous and anxious, depressed, conspiratorial. Basically, that slaves are, scared. And they're scared of white people. And can you believe that they would be scared of white people given the conditions that they live in? And so from Cartwright's perspective, remember, Cartwright believes that slavery is a positive good for slaves. So slaves, if slaves are feeling anxious, they shouldn't be feeling anxious because this is good for them. So therefore, if they're feeling anxious, there must be something wrong. And so Negro consumption was a disease that he created to explain why slaves were feeling nervous. Looking back from our modern perspective, of course, you think that, well, of course they feel nervous. They don't want to get beaten. But, that's not the mindset that Southern scientists were in at that point. Drapetomania, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the disease causing slaves to run away. Because again, from the perspective of people like Samuel Cartwright, slave's a good thing. Slaves should recognize that they're in a good place, that this is a good thing for them. And the idea that slaves would want to run away from something that is so obviously good for them was ridiculous. And so the fact that slaves tried to run away, that must mean there's something wrong, and so he gave it a name, drapetomania, a disease of the mind that causes slaves to run away from their masters. And the masters, of course, are the caretakers, the patriarchs, and all of that. So there's something wrong with slaves that want to run away. This other one, diesthesia, Ethiopus, hebetude of the mind and obtuse sensibility of body. This is one where slaves get up to mischief. They, at one point he called it rascality, where slaves get up to no good. They do things like slow down their work, break tools. They do things that seem irrational to the slave owner's mind or to the doctor's mind. Because again, these slaves should be happy. They're in a good place. They're owned by good people. They're in a better condition than they would have been if they were out on the streets. And so therefore, if a slave was to, lay down on the job, run off into the woods to take a nap, slow down the work, stuff that seems perfectly rational that we will talk about more in a few minutes here. But that's a disease from the perspective of someone like Cartwright. So he gave it this name, diesthesia Ethiopus, if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know. So anyway, we've got these, so there's the historical argument, religious argument, patriarchal arguments, scientific arguments, but the commonalities in all of these is that slavery is good. It's good for white people, obviously, but it's also good for black people, because black people would not be able to survive on their own without this system of slavery. It's built on the assumption that Northerners and Southerners share that black people were inferior to whites. So that's obviously a commonality. Slavery is universal and natural in all systems. Again, that's that historical argument. Every great society and culture has had slavery, so therefore slavery is an essential ingredient to all great societies and cultures, according to this mindset. And the belief that Southerners have the most humane slave system. Because, again, slave owners, we're taking care of these people. We're giving them, to take it to its most extreme, slave owners might say things like, I'm giving them housing, clothing, medical care. All of this stuff may be really rudimentary, housing, clothing, medical care, whatever. But from the Southerners' perspective, white people are providing that to them. And so therefore whites should be, celebrated for that. Slaves should be thankful to their masters for that treatment. And so we start to see there's this whole literature among Southerners where they try to refute abolitionist claims that slavery is an evil and all of that. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the North caused Southerners to just panic. And so one of the more famous rebuttals to Uncle Tom's Cabin was this one here, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, or Southern Life as it is, where the entire book just portrayed slaves as being these happy-go-lucky people who didn't have care in the world. They would just, they had all this free time where they could play instruments and dance and all of that. Sure, they had to go do some work to pay for this stuff, but slaves had a really good life, and Northerners should just butt out of the whole thing. cartoons like this, slavery as it exists in America, where again the slaves are happy, they're dancing, there's music, it's a good, it's a good existence from the perspective of. I mean, it's easy for white people to see it this way. Blacks, of course, didn't see it this way, which we'll talk about in just a minute here. But again, going back to our friend Cartwright, one of the phrases from his book kind of sums up what he thought, what he and a lot of other Southerners thought about this whole slavery situation. And he's talking about how, in the context here, this is still that book that's talking about all the diseases and all of that. And so he talks about that a greater mystery is the undoubted fact of the love they bear to their masters, similar in all respect to the love that children bear to their parents, which nothing but severity or cruelty in either case can alienate. The overseer among them, like the schoolmaster among children, has only to be impartial and to preserve order by strict justice to all, to gain their goodwill and affections, and to be viewed not as an object of terror, but as a friend and protector to quiet their fears of one another. So again, this is the paternalistic argument that, the good guy slave owner is going to maintain the peace, he's going to protect and shelter slaves from the vagaries of the economic world, whatever. And so basically what he's saying here, as long as slave owners and overseers, are kind and they're fair, then slaves will obviously love them. And even going back to the patriarchal thing where, the patriarch is the head of the family, they mean that he makes the analogy very clear here that it's just like how children love their parents. Children will love their parents as long as the parents are fair. And the parents can be harsh now and then, but as long as it's fair harshness, then everything's fine. So, slaves are like children in this way. Now we can talk for a few minutes about, of course, the slaves' response to all of this, which is that, unsurprisingly, probably, it turns out slaves didn't actually think that slavery was a good thing. And so all of the diseases that Cartwright came up with that I was talking about, yeah, they did all that stuff. Looking back today, of course, we would never say that it was a disease that was causing that stuff. We would just say that, no, this is a condition of slavery and people not wanting to be in slavery. But slaves engaged in all kinds of ways to resist this system, as you can probably imagine. Now, we hear about some of the dramatic episodes, like the slave rebellions, the Stono Revolt and Nat Turner's Rebellion. And so we hear about these slave uprisings. The problem, though, with those is that they never succeed. They got put down every time. And that's why we know these things, that they did not eradicate slavery, because they all failed. Because whites are always better armed, they're better organized. Slaves, when they're leading rebellions, they don't have the same advantages that whites have, and so slave rebellions always got crushed. There was still Southerners would still kind of put that out there as a source of paranoia and terror. They would say that, they could rise up again, and maybe they would succeed this time, but they never actually succeeded, which is why rebellion, that was not the most common form of resistance, slave resistance to this institution. Running away was also not a very practical choice for a lot of slaves, because you run away, the obvious question is, where are you going to go? The vast majority of slaves, they only knew the immediate surroundings to the plantation that they lived on. They might know, the way to town, and they might hear stories about, if you can cross the Ohio River and get into free territory, that you'll be free and maybe make your way to Canada. But these guys have no idea where that is. They might have a sense that it's to the north, but how far to the north? What is it going to take to get there? How many rivers am I going to cross? How many deserts am I going to cross? How many mountains am I going to cross? They have no idea. And so running away usually did not become a successful way, unless you had help with things like the Underground Railroad, where you had people that did know the territory that could help you escape. At that point, runaways can become a practical way to do it. But, one-on-one, where you've got a slave who's unhappy with the situation, running away very rarely is going to be a successful opportunity. Because again, even if you do happen to know the geography and the topography of where you are, the slave owners, once they realize you're gone, they're going to send out patrols with dogs and hunters, and the vast majority of slaves that ran away from their plantation were right back on the plantation within 24 hours. Very, very few of them actually succeeded in avoiding the dogs and the patrols and all of that. Again, without outside help. Outside help can change the odds a bit. So slaves very rarely engaged in rebellions or runaways. And what they usually just did was everyday forms of resistance. Things like, again, like I mentioned before, breaking things. You break the tool. Oh, sorry, boss, the plow broke. Don't know what to tell you. Sorry, boss, the ox died last night. I don't know what to tell you, but now we can't plow the field today. Oh, the shovel's all broke. I don't know what happened. Slaves would slow down their work. They would, because this is going back a little bit, but Adam Smith, the famous father of capitalism and one of the best known economists of the 18th century, had argued at one point that slavery was the worst form of labor in the world because slaves have no motivation to do good work. The only motivation slaves have is to avoid punishment. And so if that's the basis of your system, you're not going to have a good workforce. And it turns out to be completely true. Slaves were not good workers. Not because they're inherently bad people, but because when your only desire is to avoid getting beaten, most people are going to do the bare minimum that you can to avoid getting beaten. You're going to figure out, how slow can I work and not get beaten? And that's going to become the norm. That's going to become the way of life for the slaves. Slaves are not going to be efficient workers. You might think that, oh, well, they're free workers. They're not free workers to begin with, because slave owners, you still have to pay for their food, for their housing, for their medical care, for all that stuff. And again, it may be substandard, but you still have to pay for that stuff. So it's not free labor. It's very inefficient labor because the workers are not encouraged to do good work. There's no reward. There's no pay involved. Avoiding a beating, all you're going to do is the bare minimum necessary to avoid the beating. And so slaves would engage in everyday forms of resistance like that. Sabotage, slowing down the work, sneaking off into the woods to go take a nap or something, if you know you can get away with it without getting caught. If you read books like the Frederick Douglass memoirs, it's full of these stories about him avoiding labor and all of that because he wasn't being rewarded for it. Okay, and so slave resistance is widespread. There aren't very many slaves that like the situation that they're in, and so there aren't very many slaves that are doing good work. Okay, that should seem obvious to you. But that takes us back to, again, going back to the quote I just gave a few minutes ago from Cartwright about how slaves love their masters just like children love their parents. But what's interesting is that when emancipation comes, slaves are going to leave. And that's going to seem very surprising to people. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising to us that it was surprising to Southerners, but it was very surprising to Southerners. There was a famous quote by a South Carolina planter, a guy named Augustin Tevot. "The conduct of the Negro in the late crisis of our affairs, the Civil War, has convinced me that we were all laboring under a delusion. I believed that these people were content, happy, and attached to their masters. But events and reflection have caused me to change those positions. If they were content, happy, and attached to their masters, why did they desert him in the moment of his need and flock to an enemy whom they did not know, and thus left their perhaps really good masters whom they did know from infancy?" Southerners were shocked that slaves did not enjoy the system of slavery. And looking back on it from a modern perspective, that seems utterly ridiculous. But Southerners truly believed that slavery was a good thing, and that black people recognized it, and that white people recognized it. And really, this is what you have to understand to be able to understand why Southerners fought for the Confederacy. We talked last week about all the reasons given for secession. Slavery was the reason given for secession. And so when you think about how do you get hundreds of thousands of people to mobilize to go to war against their own country, over something like slavery, you have to understand what the mental situation that these Southerners had put themselves into. After years of things like Cartwright's weird diseases about black people and all these religious justifications for the Bible and historical justifications for slavery, religious justifications for slavery, Southerners had been convinced by all of that slavery was a positive good. And they believed it to the extent where not even non-slave owning Southern whites believed it, which is kind of the weird part. You've got non-slave owners going to war to fight for the institution of slavery, a system from which they did not benefit. In fact, it's a situation that many white Southerners actually, suffered from, because black slaves are competitors for labor. If those black slaves weren't there, then those poor whites, maybe they'd get the job. Maybe they'd get hired to do something. But there's no hiring going on because there's black slaves available. So the brilliance in some way, and you hesitate to call it this, but one of the things that Southern elites were very good at, surprisingly good at, was convincing all of the American South, or most of the American South, that this system is good. And now that we are in a crisis moment, when it comes to the Civil War, we need to go to war to protect this system. It's amazing that they were able to do this. And so we'll as we're seeing as it plays out in the readings and all of that, we're seeing how this happens. But the reality is that when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863 from, according to this historical document, from the back of a bear with a M16, I don't know what that is. But anyway, Lincoln delivers this Emancipation Proclamation, and word, of course, gets out to Southerners, to slaves, even though white Southerners try to suppress the news of the Emancipation Proclamation. Word spreads like wildfire, and of course, slaves pick up and flee. And this is just utterly demoralizing to Southerners, who had gotten into the war thinking that they were fighting on the side of the angels. They were fighting for the good system. They were fighting the good fight. But slaves getting up and leaving during this emancipation process demonstrates that, they weren't in the right. And that's going to be very troublesome for Southerners. So we'll talk more about that as the rest of the term goes on. So that's all I have for now. I will see you all online. Take care.